Shabana Basij Rasik was 6 years old when the Taliban first took over Afghanistan. She, along with every girl in the country, was thrown out of school, their records burned. Those brave girls who did try and go to school were attacked and terrorized with shootings and bombings. Thousands died. Her parents had a really hard decision to make. They wanted to protect their daughters, but knew that a life without an education, that a whole generation of young girls growing up uneducated was not good for their daughters or their country. And so they dressed up their girls as boys and sent them to what on the outside looked like an all-boys school, but was in fact an all-girls school. Luckily, she was able to get educated. She came to the United States, graduating magna cum laude from her university, and returned to a free Afghanistan, where she started Afghanistan's first and only all-girls boarding school. Just a few weeks ago, 20 years after her papers had been burned, Shabana looked out at the faces of her students and faced the same dilemma that her parents once had, wanting to protect these girls, but knowing that a life without education is no life at all. And so, her school went on a trip to Rwanda. And there they are studying abroad, at least until it is safe to return home. And Shabana burned all of the documentation so that the Taliban would not know what girls were with her, nor be able to retaliate against their family. We look at the news, whether it's Afghanistan, Louisiana, Haiti, Jackson, or Tennessee, and we see how excruciatingly painful life can be, that there is so much misery in the world. And those are extreme examples, but even us, what about us? Our high holiday theme for the year was supposed to be welcome home. You were supposed to be here with us in the sanctuary. Our teens were supposed to be singing in the choir. Our kids' kahila running in the halls. You were supposed to get to greet friends you hadn't seen in a year and a half and welcome in our new congregants. But instead, we're separated. Again, another high holidays apart. COVID making our world smaller, threatening our businesses, our way of life, and worst of all, our health, and taking lives. On top of this, we're more politically polarized than ever before. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. We are experiencing severe weather in the form of floods, fires, drought, heat waves, all of which, again, threaten our homes, our businesses, and take lives. It can be enough to have one ask, what is it that we have to expect from life anymore? During his time in Auschwitz, Dr. Viktor Frankl learned that a fellow prisoner was planning to run into the electric wire fence and take his own life rather than suffer the misery of the Nazis. He asked his fellow prisoner why he would want to take his life, and he turned to Frankl and said, "What do we have to expect from life anymore?" Now, we are not in Afghanistan or Haiti or Auschwitz, thank God. But perhaps we can learn from Frankl's response. He said, we had to learn for ourselves and furthermore teach the despairing men that it didn't really matter what we had to expect from life, but what life had to expect from us. A story is told of a businessman who came to see Reb Zalman. He had lost everything. He didn't know what to do. After listening to him for a while, Reb Zalman turned to him and said, "I'm hearing a lot about you and about what you need. But have you ever thought, what are you needed for?" COVID has made our world smaller. We are less joyful. We spend more time thinking about ourselves, our own happiness, our own needs. And even before COVID, American society was fixated on getting the most we could out of life. Just think about YOLO, you only live once, or the hashtag, living my best life. And while it's important for us to care for ourselves, we often end up doing the opposite when we fail to ask, what is it that I have to give? Where modern culture says, what does life have to offer me? Jewish wisdom says, what do I have to offer life? Frankl survived the camps and wrote one of the most widely acclaimed books in psychology of all time, Man's Search for Meaning. When he came to the United States after having been liberated from the camps, he noticed that here too, despite all of our freedoms, people felt emptiness inside. Likewise, Martin Seligman, during his time as the president of the American Psychological Association, noticed he would often help patients get through trauma, get over the negative, but they would ask at the end, well, now what? Frankl called this the existential vacuum. He taught the existential vacuum is a widespread phenomenon in the 20th century. And he pointed out loss of religion as a contributing factor. He said, man has suffered another loss in his more recent development, inasmuch as the traditions which buttressed his behaviors are now rapidly diminishing. No instinct tells him what he has to do. No tradition tells him what he ought to do. And often, he doesn't even know what he wishes to do. In other words, as modern culture shifts away from community toward the individual, away from commandedness toward individual autonomy, we have ironically not become happier, but emptier. It's like when you're eating pizza and you can't get full, and you keep eating and eating, but the food that you're eating has no nutrients. We too fill ourselves up with things that do not nourish our souls. We can feel it, that pull for more. This feeling often causes us to seek out immediate satisfaction, something to fill the void inside, whether it's food, drugs, alcohol, Netflix, fixating on our exterior, when what we really need is to work on what's on the inside. Jewish wisdom teaches that void inside is in fact sacred space. There is a Hasidic practice called bitul. Bitul roughly means nothingness. It's based on the Kabbalistic idea that in order to make space for creation, God, who fills creation, had to do something called tzimtzum. God had to contract God's self to make space for something that was not God, to make space for you, for me, for creation. Bitul, this nothingness, is us making space inside for things that are not us. Psalm 81 warns, let no strange God be within you. Our rabbis understood this small, strange God within us to be ourselves, teaching we can be so full of ourselves that we fail to leave places inside for God. Hence, we need this practice of bitul, of emptying ourselves. Bitul practice teaches that obsessing over what you need in order to make yourself feel good is often the very thing that is getting in the way of your happiness and finding your purpose. A few biblical examples. The first comes from our matriarch, Rebecca. She had been married to Isaac for 20 years and still hadn't had a child. She asks her husband to plead with God, which he does, and finally she becomes pregnant. But the pregnancy is so not what she expected. She is so uncomfortable that she cries out, Im ken lama ze anochi. If this is the way it is going to be, why do I even exist? Moses, in Numbers, asks God to let him die rather than have to put up with the complaints of the children of Israel. Job, in his unending despair, exclaims, it should have been as though I had not been. Here we see Rebecca too reaching this point where she can no longer cope. So we see that even our greatest Jewish leaders had points where they felt such pain, they wondered if they could even continue. And it's only when they realized that they were part of something bigger than themselves that they were able to push forward. When they emptied themselves of themselves, they were able to change that question of what good can I get from life to what good can I give to life? Most self-help books talk about self-care and me time, but the concept of bitul teaches that the best way to learn to love yourself is to not make yourself the center of your universe. The idea of bitul is that in order to grow, you have to make space inside for things that are not about you. Focusing on the self, whether it be looks, talents, successes, mistakes, awards, what I want, is a recipe for fear and depression. But when we focus on how we can use those strengths and talents, achievements, and even weaknesses for the benefit of others, we start to feel more fulfilled. We've been born into a world of brokenness and need. We have a choice when we're confronted by that brokenness. We can use our unique gifts to fill that need, or we can ignore it. As Mordecai said to Esther when he was asking her to go and plead on behalf of the Jewish people to the king, if you don't do this, perhaps help will come from some other place, but who knows? Maybe you are in the palace for a moment such as this. When we are miserable, or when we're just feeling empty, it might mean that it's time to not ask what in life can fulfill me, but what need can I fulfill? When the pain of the world is what is making us miserable, we have a choice to run away or to ask, what am I needed for? Frederick Buechner is an American writer, theologian, and Presbyterian minister, and he defines vocation as the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. So what is your great gladness? What is something you love to do that makes you feel strong? And where might that be needed in the world? When I was going through my cancer treatment, I read so many books, most of which I have forgotten. But there was a passage from one book written by a doctor that has stuck with me that I've returned to many times. It's the story of a patient that came to him. They had tried everything, but there was no more treatments to offer this man. He was going to die. And he came to the doctor, and the doctor felt so bad because there was nothing he could do to save his life. But the man said, "Doctor, I really just don't even know why I'm here anymore. In fact, I don't know why I was even born." He explained to the doctor that he hadn't been the best person, that he'd gotten into trouble with the law, been arrested a few times, abused drugs, alcohol. He'd never kept a relationship. And now he was dying, and it was too late to turn anything around. The doctor looked at him, and he said, "Well, surely there's something good about you, something you're good at." And the man sat and thought for a while, and he said, "You know, I am pretty good with my hands." And the doctor said, "Well, is there a place that could be used?" And the man said to him, "Well, you know, there is this church a few blocks from my house, and I've noticed that the roof is looking pretty bad. I bet I could help them with their roof." And the doctor said, "Well, that sounds like an idea," and sent the man away, feeling empty-hearted that he couldn't do anything to save this man's life. And the man didn't return, and so the doctor thought that was that. And then, months later, he got a phone call. The man was calling him, and he was on his deathbed. He explained to the doctor how he had gone to the church, how he had, in fact, fixed their roof, how when he was up on that roof, parishioners used to yell hello, greet him as they came in. Eventually, they began to invite him inside to enjoy some food and lemonade, about how he began to exchange pleasantries with people, got to know their names, how when he finished fixing the roof, he began to fix things inside the church. He began to explain what it felt like to be part of a community, what it felt like to have people say thank you, to have people be grateful for him. And he said, "Doctor, I just wanted to take the time before I died to say thank you for saving my life." Life is not about longevity. It's about quality, impact, mitzvot. And a full life is not about milking all we can from it. It's about giving all we can to it. This man lived the most fulfilling part of his life when he knew he was dying, because he finally didn't make his life about him anymore. He found a way that his deep gladness could meet the world's deep need. The Baal Shem Tov taught perhaps a soul is brought to our world for 70 or 80 years just to do a favor for a friend. You don't have to tackle all the problems of the world in order to make your mark on it. You can change lives, especially your own, by just responding to the need that is in front of you. Bitul is a way of living. It requires daily work and practice, but it's something we can all do. How wonderful is that? The solution to one of the biggest emotional problems in life, that existential vacuum, that emptiness inside, is something that we can achieve. And we can start right now by asking, what am I needed for? In this COVID era, with polarized politics, ecological destruction, political turmoil, so much pain in the world, and so many ways to distract ourselves, we starve our souls when we fill up our lives with things that just distract us from that void inside. Our faith teaches us that when we stop thinking about life as something that should serve us, and instead began to focus on how we can serve others, we get closer to finding the meaning and fulfillment we've been looking for all along. So may 5782 be a year where our deep gladness meets the world's deep need. May we find ways to empty ourselves of ourselves to make space for others and the divine. May our soul's hunger be nourished. And when we begin to wonder what we have to expect from life anymore, may we have the wisdom to turn that question around and ask, what is it that I have to offer life? Shana Tova u'Mituka.